Hello, my friends. My name is Thomas, but most people just call me Tom. I'm in my 70s now, a stage of life that, while peaceful in many ways, is also full of lessons learned the hard way. I spent my younger days working hard, raising a family, and trying to build a future I could look back on with pride. I thought the toughest times were behind me. After all, I'd worked, saved, and sacrificed. Now, in my golden years, I believed I would be reaping the rewards of all that effort. I had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, who were my pride and joy. Like many parents, I poured my heart into raising them, always hoping they'd grow up strong, independent, and kind. I dreamed about growing old near them, believing that when the time came, I would have a warm support system around me, maybe even the chance to help with my grandchildren. I imagined Sunday family dinners, holidays filled with laughter, and a life where I could be a part of theirs without feeling like a burden. When my wife passed away a few years ago, my plans for those family gatherings and my dreams of companionship were shattered. It felt like the whole purpose of my future had been taken away. My children were all grown by then, each with busy lives, careers, and families of their own in different cities. In my grief, I made a decision that I believed would ease my loneliness. I decided to move closer to my daughter, Emily, the one I thought would understand me best. Looking back, I realize now that my choice to move close to my children, hoping for family togetherness, might have been one of the most challenging mistakes of my life. It wasn't their fault, of course. Life simply has a way of being unpredictable. Moving near my daughter, instead of bringing us closer together, introduced new tensions, frustrations, and even a sense of lost independence that I hadn't expected. I know now that I'm not alone in feeling this way. Many people in our generation face these same struggles, yet no one really talks about them openly. In this journey of moving closer to my children, I learned a great deal. These aren't easy topics to discuss, but I feel it's important to share my story, along with the stories of a few friends, because perhaps it can shed light on the complex reality behind a well-intentioned decision. Let me take you through this journey of what I learned about the idea of living near your children in old age, and why sometimes it might not be the perfect solution we imagine. When I first told Emily I was thinking about moving closer to her, she seemed genuinely pleased. She said she'd love to have me nearby, and that the kids would be excited to see more of their grandpa. I can't tell you how happy I felt in that moment. I imagined joining in for birthdays, helping out with little projects around her house, and maybe even babysitting when she and her husband wanted a night out. But what started with so much promise quickly began to shift. I'd found a small apartment about 15 minutes away from her home, which felt close enough to be accessible, but far enough to give her family their own space. However, once I'd settled in, I noticed that her life was far busier than I'd anticipated. Our visits were shorter than I'd hoped for, and the kids, as sweet as they were, often had plans and activities that took priority. Then came the uncomfortable part, the unspoken assumptions. I had thought that, being close, I would see them often. But Emily, well-meaning as she was, had her own life to manage. I soon found myself in a tricky position, one that was uncomfortable for both of us. I would drop by or call, thinking it would be no big deal, only to sense a subtle hesitance on her end. Sometimes she'd say, "Dad, I wish you'd told me you were coming," or "Can we plan something later? The kids have a busy week." Little by little, I realized that my presence, the very reason I'd moved, had, in a way, become a bit of an intrusion. I'll be honest with you, it hurt. Sitting in my little apartment just a short drive from Emily's house, I felt lonelier than I ever had back in my old town. I had uprooted my life, left behind my friends and my routines, all to be near my daughter. Yet here I was, more isolated than ever. I began to wonder if this was common for others in my shoes, to feel this mix of regret, confusion, and a subtle sense of shame. One day I met George, a neighbor in my building, and we struck up a conversation over our morning coffee. George was in his 60s, a little younger than me, and he had a son nearby. He shared a similar story. He had moved to be closer to his family, but they were always too busy to really spend time with him. Hearing his experience was both a comfort and a wake-up call. George told me something that really stuck with me. Sometimes, Tom, moving to be close to family can make you feel like a ghost in their world. You're there, but not really part of their lives. George and I would sit on the bench outside our building, talking about the old days and the strange isolation we felt despite our families living nearby. It wasn't that we expected constant attention, but there was a sense of longing for connection, a feeling that we were missing out on the close-knit bond we had once hoped for. One thing I didn't fully grasp when I moved was how my presence, despite my intentions, might add pressure to Emily's already full life. I could tell she loved me, and she wanted to be a good daughter. But I started noticing subtle changes in her tone and attitude. She began to seem more stressed, apologizing for not being able to see me as often as I'd hoped, and sometimes even suggesting I look into activities or groups in the area to keep busy. I remember one evening, sitting across from her in her kitchen, she looked so tired. She was working full-time, managing her kids' schedules and taking care of her household, and here I was, wanting her time too. In that moment, I realized that my presence, the hope I'd clung to for comfort and connection, was unintentionally adding to her responsibilities. I recalled a conversation with another old friend, Betty, who had a similar experience with her son, Mark. She had moved to be closer to him, but quickly found that her dependency had created guilt and frustration for him. Betty shared her regret with me one day over tea, saying, "Tom, sometimes I think we don't realize how much we ask of them just by being nearby. They feel they have to take care of us, even if we don't ask outright. And that's a heavy burden when they're already balancing so much." As someone who had been independent my entire life, the move brought an unexpected struggle. Back in my hometown, I knew the people, the places, and had my routines. But moving closer to Emily, I suddenly found myself in unfamiliar surroundings, and without my usual support network, I relied on her more than I'd expected. Simple tasks like figuring out the local pharmacy, finding new doctors, or even where to get my car serviced felt overwhelming. I'd call Emily for guidance, which at first she was happy to provide. But over time, I sensed that it became a strain. I wanted to maintain my independence, yet the reality of aging meant I needed help. And there were moments when I wondered if moving closer had stripped me of the very autonomy I cherished. My friend George put it perfectly. Sometimes, Tom, the closer you move to family, the harder it is to stand on your own feet. We don't think of it that way, but when you live near them, you start to lean on them. It's not wrong, but it's a fine line between staying close and becoming a burden. George had chosen, after a couple of tough years, to move back to his old town, where he had more freedom and connections. The move gave him back a sense of self. I remember his words well. "We love our kids, Tom, but sometimes staying a little distant keeps us stronger. It lets them focus on their lives without us hovering nearby, and it reminds us to keep living our own." As time passed, I began to understand that living close to family in old age can bring to light aspects of our relationships that we may not have anticipated. Moving to be near Emily meant that I wasn't just sharing occasional moments with her anymore. Instead, I was now part of the fabric of her everyday life. And sometimes that closeness revealed parts of our dynamic that hadn't been as visible before. For instance, there were days when Emily and I would have small disagreements. Nothing major, just differences in opinions on how things should be done, or times when my advice, meant well, was met with a polite but firm, "Dad, I've got it covered." In my head, I wanted to help, to guide, and to share my experience, but in her world, it was sometimes seen as overstepping. Living further apart might have kept those moments limited to holidays or weekend visits, where everyone is on their best behavior. But being so close, I saw the strain in her face when I showed up unannounced, or the subtle shift in her tone when she felt overwhelmed. I spoke with a friend, Evelyn, who had also moved closer to her children in her later years. She'd been so excited to live near her daughter Clara, but after a few months, she found herself constantly at odds with Clara's parenting style. Evelyn would sometimes give advice on how to handle Clara's teenage daughter, hoping to offer wisdom, but Clara took it as criticism. "I just wanted to help," Evelyn told me, but Clara started avoiding me. I never meant to make her feel judged, but it's hard to remember that our kids need space to make their own decisions, even if we don't agree with them. Evelyn's story resonated with me. In moving closer, our desire to stay connected to our children's lives sometimes means crossing boundaries without realizing it. I learned that, as parents, even when our advice comes from love and experience, our children may view it differently, especially when they're trying to balance their own responsibilities. One of the biggest lessons I learned was the necessity of creating a life of my own, separate from my children, even if I had moved close to them. In my small apartment near Emily, I initially thought that proximity to family would be enough. I thought I could fill my days with visits, with grandparent duties, and with family gatherings. But as time went on, I realized that I needed to find my own friends, my own activities, and my own sense of purpose. I remember joining a local senior center, where I met folks who had also moved to be closer to family, only to discover the same reality I had. The senior center became a kind of sanctuary for us. We shared our stories, our concerns, and our frustrations. It was a space where we could talk about these things without feeling guilty or like we were complaining. I met folks like Barbara, who had a similar experience. She had moved across the country to be closer to her son, only to find that he and his wife were too busy to spend much time with her. I came all the way here, and I felt so alone, she confided in me. But once she found friends and activities outside of her family, she started to feel a bit more like herself again. I began to join group outings and even took up a painting class. This was a turning point for me because it reminded me of the value of living a life that's more than just being dad or grandpa. It gave me a sense of purpose beyond the family, a place where I was just Tom, not someone's aging father needing to be looked after. One of the trickiest aspects of living close to my children was learning to set boundaries, not just for their sake, but for my own. In the beginning, I was eager to be involved, but over time I saw that constantly showing up or calling might make them feel pressured or uncomfortable. I didn't want to lose touch, but I also didn't want my presence to become something they dreaded. After a heartfelt conversation with Emily, I realized that it was time to find a balance that respected both her family's needs and my own desire for connection. We agreed to set up regular family dinners every Sunday, so there was a time each week when we'd get together. I would call her during the week to check in, but I made it a point to wait for her invitation or ask first if she had time to chat. I learned to respect her space, to let her come to me when she wanted to share her life or needed advice. My friend George had also found a similar solution. He shared his story of setting boundaries with his son, saying, "When I stopped dropping by unannounced and instead waited for an invitation, it actually brought us closer." They appreciated my respect for their time, and they began to include me more often because it was on their terms. George's approach taught me the importance of patience and the need to let our children initiate contact sometimes. Setting boundaries allowed me to reclaim my independence while still being part of my daughter's life, without the underlying tension that I might be overstepping. And over time, I came to appreciate that these boundaries weren't barriers. They were a foundation for a healthier, more genuine relationship. The journey wasn't easy, and there were moments when I questioned my choice to move so close to Emily. At times, I missed my old home, the familiar faces, and the routines I'd left behind. There were days when the loneliness hit hard, and I thought about moving back, but I also knew that the distance had brought valuable lessons. I learned that, as much as we love our children, our lives don't need to revolve around theirs. In talking to friends like George, Evelyn, and Barbara, I realized that many of us go through a phase of regret or doubt. It's a natural part of the process, especially when we realize that the vision we had of spending our days close to family, always surrounded by love, might not be as easy or fulfilling as we had imagined. But with time, I learned to accept the reality of this stage of life. Finding acceptance meant understanding that moving close to family wasn't a mistake, but rather a learning experience. I had to reshape my expectations, find my own community, and set boundaries that would allow Emily and me to have a healthy, loving relationship without overwhelming each other. As I grew more comfortable with my life here, I found a new sense of peace. I became grateful for the moments we did spend together, rather than focusing on the times when they were too busy. I came to realize that being nearby didn't mean losing myself or my own identity, but instead offered a chance to redefine what family meant in this new chapter. These realizations brought a lot of insight, but they also laid the groundwork for some practical strategies that I, and many others, have found helpful in making the most of our proximity to family without losing our own sense of independence and self-worth. Moving close to family in our later years doesn't have to mean giving up our independence or becoming overly dependent on our children. With a few mindful strategies, we can keep our sense of self and create a more harmonious relationship with our family. Here are some insights that I, along with others who've walked a similar path, have found to be helpful. One of the first things I learned was that relying solely on family for companionship can lead to disappointment and feelings of isolation. Having your own activities, hobbies, and social groups provides a sense of purpose that doesn't depend on anyone else. For me, joining a senior center and picking up painting classes gave me a whole new circle of friends and a routine I could look forward to every week. A friend, Jim, had a similar experience. After moving closer to his daughter, he initially spent most of his time alone, waiting for her to have free time. But once he joined a local history club, he found a passion for storytelling and connected with people who shared his interests. Jim told me, "I was so busy trying to be a part of my daughter's world that I forgot I still had my own." Finding that balance with my own community made all the difference. If you're able, look into local clubs, senior activities, or even volunteering opportunities. Not only do they provide a way to meet people, but they give us a sense of control over our own lives. Instead of waiting for family members to make time for us, we can find joy and purpose on our own. Before I moved closer to Emily, I didn't take the time to discuss our expectations for what our lives together would look like. In hindsight, this could have saved us both a lot of confusion and frustration. If you're considering moving closer to family, it's essential to have an honest conversation about how often you'll see each other, what kind of support you might need, and what boundaries will help maintain everyone's comfort. It might feel uncomfortable to bring up these topics, but trust me, it's worth it. My friend Evelyn shared how she and her daughter, Clara, agreed on family days each month after an initial period of miscommunication. "At first, I felt like I was intruding whenever I reached out," she said. "But once we talked, I understood that Clara wanted time with me too, but needed to fit it into her busy life. Setting expectations took away the guessing and made our time together more enjoyable." Setting up these boundaries might mean agreeing on a regular day to get together, like a weekly dinner or a shared activity, but also respecting each other's need for space. This creates a routine without adding unspoken obligations that could lead to frustration. One of the hardest lessons I learned was that living close to family doesn't mean we'll always see each other more often. But what helped me find peace was shifting my perspective. Instead of measuring our relationship by how often I saw Emily and her family, I began to focus on the quality of our time together. When we started having weekly Sunday dinners, I made an effort to be present and enjoy each moment, instead of thinking about how long it would be until I saw them again. Those dinners became a cherished time for both of us, free of the pressures that can sometimes build up from frequent visits or unexpected drop-ins. Another friend, Sarah, who moved to be close to her son, found joy in spending dedicated days with her grandchildren at the zoo or museum, rather than frequent but rushed visits. She told me, "We don't need to be there all the time to show we care. Those special days, where I'm focused on just them, are worth more than a dozen drop-ins." This shift to quality time allows us to make more meaningful memories, and our family often appreciates us more for the focused, intentional connection. Moving close to family sometimes leads to a blurring of boundaries, as both sides try to adjust to a new closeness. When I first moved, I thought nothing of calling Emily at any time or visiting unannounced. But I quickly realized that respecting her space was essential to keeping a positive relationship. She needed the freedom to live her life without feeling she had to look after me constantly. Reclaiming my boundaries meant finding the confidence to take care of my needs and not depending on her for every small thing. Whether it was handling household tasks, making new friends, or getting involved in local activities, it reminded me that I am still capable and independent. This isn't just good for our own sense of dignity, it also lets our children know that we don't expect them to put their lives on hold for us. Take, for example, my friend Mike, who moved to be closer to his daughter, Jenna. He made a conscious choice to take public transportation rather than asking her to drive him around. At first, Jenna worried about him managing on his own, but over time, Mike found it gave him freedom, and it showed her that he could still take care of himself. "I don't want her to feel like I'm watching her every move," Mike said. "She has her own family, and I want her to see me as her father, not her dependent." One thing life has taught me is that change doesn't stop just because we're older. We can still grow, adapt, and learn to handle new situations. Moving closer to family is a transition, and like any major life change, it takes time to adjust. Some days will feel rewarding, and others might be difficult. But if we keep an open mind, it's possible to find a way to make this choice work for everyone involved. In my case, adapting meant letting go of certain expectations and learning to enjoy what was possible, rather than what I had initially hoped for. Instead of daily visits and shared meals every evening, I found joy in the occasional family gatherings, in my own new hobbies, and in a life that was a blend of independence and family connection. I think often about my friend George's words. Moving near family isn't about stepping back into their lives. It's about finding a new way to connect without losing your own path. Those words resonate with me because they remind us that our lives, even now, are filled with possibilities, choices, and moments of personal growth. As we reach this stage in life, it's natural to want the comfort and security of family nearby. But sometimes, what seems like the obvious choice, moving closer to our children, can introduce unexpected challenges. By building our own communities, setting boundaries, and focusing on the quality of our time together, we can create a balance that honors both our independence and our desire to stay connected. In the end, the journey isn't about how physically close we are to our children. It's about the emotional closeness we cultivate, the respect we build, and the moments of joy we find, whether near or far. We're still growing, still learning, and still finding ways to live fully, even as our roles shift. And that, my friends, is something worth cherishing. Sometimes the best insights come from hearing the stories of others who have walked this path before us. Each person's experience with living near family in old age brings a unique perspective, and each story holds lessons we can all relate to. Here are some real-life examples that illustrate both the rewards and the challenges of moving closer to family. Margaret, a retired teacher, moved to be closer to her daughter Lisa when she was in her late 70s. She found a small apartment in a senior-friendly community only 10 minutes away from Lisa's home. Margaret was thrilled about the idea of being part of her grandchildren's lives, and she imagined spending time with them every week. But after settling in, she found that her frequent visits didn't always match her daughter's expectations. "I thought I'd be seeing them every day, or at least a few times a week," Margaret told me. "But Lisa and her husband have busy lives, and I quickly saw that dropping in unannounced wasn't always welcome." After a few tense moments and an honest conversation, Margaret and Lisa agreed to something they called the shared life model. They set up a weekly routine of Sunday dinners, with occasional family days at the park, or outings to events in town. Margaret also took the initiative to get involved in her new community, joining a book club and a gardening group. "I realized that I didn't need to be in their lives all the time to feel close to them," she said. "I needed to have my own life as well." The shared life model became a comfortable arrangement for both of them, allowing Margaret to be close to her family without creating any feelings of dependency or intrusion. David, a former engineer, had been contemplating a move closer to his son, Jonathan, after his wife passed away. Jonathan lived in a different state, and David initially thought he might sell his house and find a place nearby. But after careful consideration, he chose to stay where he was. David explained his reasoning to me one afternoon over coffee. "I love my son, and he's a great man, but I realized that moving closer would make me feel like I was leaning on him too much. I wanted to give him the space to live his life without feeling like he had to look after me. Instead, David chose to visit Jonathan and his family a few times a year, making their time together special and meaningful. In his own town, David continued his hobbies and stayed active in his church and community. He found that staying where he was gave him a sense of stability, and he didn't feel the need to adjust to a new place or new people. Sometimes, we think we need to be physically close to be emotionally close, but that's not always the case, David said. Jonathan and I talk on the phone regularly, and he knows I'm here if he needs me. I just don't want him to feel burdened. Sarah, in her early 80s, took a different approach altogether. She moved in with her daughter, Anne, and Anne's family after a fall made living alone difficult. While the arrangement worked well for the first few months, Sarah found it challenging to adjust to the dynamics of Anne's household. Living with your child isn't like it was when they were young, Sarah admitted with a laugh. I had to learn to be part of their routines without expecting things to always go my way. She shared how difficult it was at first to let go of certain household routines and respect her daughter's authority in her own home. But as time passed, Sarah learned to adapt, finding ways to contribute without overstepping. One of Sarah's strategies was to take on small responsibilities that fit within Anne's routines, like making breakfast for the family or doing some light gardening. By focusing on these contributions, Sarah felt she had a role in the household without feeling out of place. Living with family can be a wonderful thing, she told me. But it's all about finding a balance and remembering that it's their home too. Anne, on her part, shared that having her mother close brought many unexpected moments of connection and gratitude. But she also found that setting up dedicated times for each family member to have their own space made it easier. Anne and her husband took turns having quiet evenings for themselves, while Sarah respected those moments and found other activities to keep herself engaged. Tom and Barbara, a couple in their 70s, faced a unique challenge. They wanted to be close to their daughter, Jane, but didn't want to give up their independence. After exploring different options, they decided to buy a small house about 5 blocks away from Jane's place. This way, they could live nearby without feeling like they were intruding on her daily life. We call it the separate but close arrangement, Tom told me. We're close enough to visit, babysit the grandkids, or have meals together, but far enough that we can still feel like we have our own lives. Tom and Barbara set a rule that they'd only visit when invited, and they kept their own schedules and social activities outside of family time. This setup worked well for both sides, allowing Jane to have her space while knowing her parents were nearby. The arrangement also gave Tom and Barbara the freedom to keep their routines and friendships intact. Living separately but nearby has given us the best of both worlds, Barbara said. We're part of their lives without being too much a part of their lives, if you know what I mean. These stories remind us that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to living close to family in our later years. Each person's path is different, and each choice brings its own set of benefits and challenges. But the common thread through all these experiences is the need for balance, respect, and a focus on maintaining our own identity and sense of purpose. What I've learned, and what these stories reinforce, is that staying close to family doesn't have to mean losing ourselves. By setting boundaries, keeping open lines of communication, and finding ways to stay active in our own lives, we can create a fulfilling, supportive relationship with our loved ones without feeling like we've sacrificed our independence. As we reach this stage in life, many of us face a choice that we once never imagined: how close we want to be to the children we raised, the family we love. Moving closer, finding balance, or choosing to stay apart, each choice has its rewards and challenges. Yet no matter the path we choose, one truth remains: our journey is still ours to shape. We are still capable of love, of connection, and of growth, even as the world around us changes. Perhaps you too have thought about moving near your children, or maybe you already have. If so, you understand what it's like to walk this path with hope, sometimes uncertainty, and always with love. We all long for closeness, but also want to hold on to the independence we've cherished for a lifetime. The balance can be delicate, yet finding it allows us to live in harmony with those we care about. Remember, there's no single right choice. Each of us must decide what's best for our lives, our families, and ourselves. And in making that choice, we carry with us the wisdom of our experiences, the love of our families, and the resilience that has seen us through so much. As we close this conversation, I invite you to share your thoughts, experiences, and wisdom in the comments below. Have you found a way to balance closeness with independence? Do you have any tips for those just starting this journey? Your insights might be just what another person needs to hear. Let's share our stories and help each other walk this path with grace, understanding, and open hearts. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of this journey.